In 5 years, every merchant who passed through Cinder Falls, Wyoming territory bought their medicine from two orphans the whole town once called the Fools of the Old Madman. This is how they did it. Cincinnati, Ohio, March of 1881. The city smelled of coal smoke and river water and the particular sourness of too many people living too close together in buildings that had never been built to last. The textile mills ran day and night, 6 days a week, and the sound of the looms was so constant that the people who worked them stopped hearing it after the first month, the way you stopped hearing your own heartbeat, the way you stopped noticing the cold after your hands had been numb long enough. Wren Calloway was 17 years old and she had stopped noticing the cold 4 winters ago. She worked the sorting tables on the mill's second floor, her fingers moving through bolts of unfinished cloth with a speed that her supervisors noted in their ledgers and never once mentioned to her face. She was slight and sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid and eyes the color of winter creek water, gray and still and clear all the way down. She watched everything. She measured everything. She forgot nothings. These were not qualities that the sorting tables required, and so she kept them to herself the way she kept most things folded small and stored in some interior place where they would not be wasted on people who would not understand their value. Her brother Colt was 19. He worked the looms on the floor above her, and the looms had been working on him in return for the past 5 years, curving his shoulders forward and roughening his hands, and putting a flatness behind his eyes that had not been there when he was 14 and their father was still alive. He had been the man of the family since he was 10 years old, a responsibility no 10-year-old boy should carry, and he had carried it the way strong people carry things that are too heavy for them, without complaint, without rest, with a steadiness that looked from the outside like strength and felt from the inside like something being slowly used up. Their mother, Matilda, had died 4 months before in January, during the coldest week anyone in Cincinnati could remember since the war. Typhoid fever. The doctor had said there was nothing to be done, which was the truth, and had charged them $2 for saying it, which was also the truth of how the world worked. She was 41 years old. She had come from Bavaria as a young woman, a trained nurse and herbalist, who had crossed an ocean for a life that the ocean did not owe her. And she had built that life piece by piece from river clay and determination in a city that had no particular interest in whether she succeeded. For 18 years, she had taught her daughter everything she knew. Wren could identify over 150 plants by scent alone in the dark in any season. She knew how to extract resin from a living stem without killing the plant, how to read the behavior of bees to determine the precise moment for harvest, how to tell good honey from bad by the color of the comb and the weight of it on a wooden spoon. She knew which roots were toxic in summer and medicinal in winter. She knew which bark reduced fever and which flowers dried and powdered could slow bleeding faster than any bandage a Milltown doctor could provide. She knew all of this the way other girls her age knew the words to hymns or the names of the boys in the neighborhood. Not because she had studied it deliberately, but because she had sat beside her mother every evening for 10 years watching and listening and absorbing her mind, working the way certain soils work, taking in everything and releasing nothing until the moment it was needed. None of this knowledge paid the rent. The rent was due at the end of the month. They had $52 between them, saved over 2 years of double shifts and no indulgences. They had a 2-room apartment above a butcher shop that smelled of blood and sawdust and the cold grease of rendered fat. They had jobs that paid enough to survive and promised nothing beyond another week of the same. What they did not have was a future. Not in Cincinnati. Not in any city that ran on the logic of the mills, which was the logic of using people up slowly enough that they didn't notice until there was nothing left to use. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, delivered by a young clerk from a law office downtown, who stood in the hallway of their building with the careful discomfort of a man who has been sent somewhere he was not meant to go. He held a large envelope with both hands and gave it to Colt and did not make eye contact, and left quickly as if poverty were something that could follow a man home if he wasn't careful about where he looked. Colt brought the envelope to the kitchen table and set it down without opening it. Wren was at the stove heating the thin soup that had been their supper for the past 2 weeks. She turned and looked at the envelope and looked at her brother's face. She left the soup and came to the table. The envelope contained 2 things: a single sheet of legal paper dense with precise handwriting and a smaller folded note tucked behind it, written in a different script entirely cramped and slanted in a way that suggested the writer had been in some kind of hurry. Colt read the legal letter first. He read it twice, his expression not changing, and then he set it flat on the table and looked at the wall for a moment before he spoke. Their father had an older brother, he said, a man named Phineas Calloway, whom neither of them had ever met, and whose existence their father had mentioned perhaps twice in Wren's memory, always briefly, always without explanation. Phineas had spent 15 years in Wyoming Territory on a piece of land he had acquired near a settlement called Cinder Falls. He had died the previous November. He had no wife, no children, no other living relatives. The land, 260 acres of Wyoming Territory, now belonged to his nearest surviving kin. That meant Colt and Wren. Colt finished explaining and went quiet. Wren picked up the smaller note. It was folded once the paper yellowed at the edges, the writing cramped and urgent with a pressure behind it that she recognized immediately. She had seen that pressure in her mother's handwriting, sometimes in the notes Matilda left on medical cases she couldn't stop thinking about. It was the handwriting of someone who needed to say something important and was afraid they would not have enough time to say it properly. She read it. Then she read it again. Then a third time, her lips moving, slightly absorbing each word the way she absorbed everything completely, without remainder. The note said this: "There is something growing on this rock that no one here has the sense to see the value of. Do not listen to them. Do not sell." That was all. No explanation of what was growing, no instruction for how to find it, no map, no description, no name. Just a dead man's handwriting on yellowed paper telling them not to sell a piece of land in a territory neither of them had ever seen for reasons a dead man was no longer available to explain. Colt looked at her across the table. She could see him running the arithmetic already the way he always ran it, quickly and without sentiment. He said, or he was crazy. "We never met the man. Father never talked about him. For all we know, he spent 15 years out there talking to rocks and died alone and mad." Wren set the note down flat on the table. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the handwriting, the slant of it, the pressure behind the letters. A man who was simply confused did not write this way. A man who was simply eccentric did not write this way. A man who was afraid, who had found something real, and was afraid of what would happen to it after he was gone, wrote exactly this way. He knew something, she said, and he wanted us to know it too. People who are losing their minds don't write this clearly. They don't know what they know well enough to say it in 6 words. Colt looked at the legal letter. He looked at the note. He looked at his sister. She was 17 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes and a quality of stillness that people sometimes mistook for shyness until they had been in a room with her for long enough to understand that it was not shyness at all. It was attention. She was paying attention to something most people could not see, and she was waiting for it to tell her what it meant. "What else do we have?" she said. It was not quite a question. They both knew the answer. They had $52 and a lease that expired at the end of the month, and jobs that would not mourn them if they left, and no particular reason to believe that the next year in this city would be different from the last 5. She said, "We go." Colt looked at her. She said it again quietly and without repetition because she had already decided. "We go." 3 weeks later, they sold everything they could not carry. Wren packed a small trunk with clothes, 3 of her mother's books on plant medicine, a leather pouch of seeds and dried herbs that had been Matilda's most prized possessions, and a wool blanket that still held the faint smell of the lavender her mother kept in a sachet in the linen chest. She packed the 2 notes, the legal letter, and Phineas Calloway's cramped warning, folded together inside the cover of the largest plant medicine book. Colt bought 2 train tickets to Cheyenne. They left Cincinnati on a cold morning before the city was fully awake. Neither of them looked back at the building above the butcher shop at the window of the 2 rooms where their mother had died, and their father had been a memory, and their childhoods had been conducted in the narrow corridor between survival and not quite. There was nothing there worth looking back for. The journey west took 9 days. They traveled by rail through the flat middle of the country, through Indiana, and across the Mississippi at Burlington, and through the wide grain fields of Iowa and Nebraska that went on long enough to become their own kind of silence. Wren sat with her face turned to the window and watched the landscape change in a way she had never seen any landscape change, the cities thinning to towns, the towns thinning to farmhouses, The farmhouses thinning to open ground that stretched in every direction as far as the light reached, with nothing vertical in it but the occasional cottonwood and the telephone poles running alongside the track. She had lived her entire life in cities. She had seen dirt only in alleys and in the narrow strips of ground beside buildings where nothing grew except the things that didn't need permission. She had never seen land that had not been claimed, shaped, built upon, named, and used until it was tired. What she was looking at now from the train window was something entirely different. It was land that was simply itself, that had not been asked yet to be anything else, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she did not have a word for. Colt slept when he could. He was 19 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with how many hours he had been awake. He was tired in the way of a person who has been holding something up for too long without setting it down, the specific exhaustion of someone who carries a responsibility before they are ready for it and then carries it anyway year after year until carrying it becomes the only way they know how to stand. He did not expect anything good to come of Wyoming. He did not say this to his sister because he understood her in the way that people who have lived in close quarters through significant loss understand each other, which is to say almost completely and without needing many words. He understood that she had seen something in Phineas Calloway's cramped note that he could not see, and he understood that her vision in these matters had never failed in the years he had been paying attention to it, and he understood that his own doubt was the doubt of a young man who had been disappointed enough times to stop expecting otherwise. He let her lead. He had been letting her lead since their mother died, in the quiet internal way that older siblings sometimes accept the authority of a younger one when the younger one has something the older one does not, which in this case was certainty. They changed trains in Cheyenne and hired a wagon north into the high country with a driver named Rufus, a weathered man of indeterminate age who charged them $8 for 3 days of travel and maintained a silence so complete that it began to feel companionable after the first afternoon. He pointed out landmarks without being asked and warned them twice about rattlesnakes and spoke perhaps 40 words across the entire journey, which suited both of them. The landscape changed again as they moved north and the elevation climbed. The flat grassland gave way to rolling ground. The rolling ground gave way to ridges, and the air thinned and cooled and took on a quality that Wren noticed immediately, a sharpness that carried something she could not name, something clean and faintly medicinal that sat at the back of her palate like the ghost of a plant she had not yet identified. She noted it and said nothing and stored it in the part of her mind where she kept the things that would matter later. On the second day at a relay station that consisted of a log building and a water trough and 2 horses in a small corral, the dog appeared. Wren had climbed down from the wagon to stretch her legs while Rufus watered the horses. The air at this altitude had a different weight than Cincinnati air, lighter and colder and somehow more honest, and she stood beside the water trough with her eyes on the mountains to the west, the snow-capped peaks catching the afternoon light in a way that made them look almost transparent. She heard nothing. There was no warning sound. One moment she was standing alone, and the next moment the animal was simply there 10 feet away watching her. It was large for a dog, tall in the leg, and broad through the chest with a coat the color of weathered silver that caught the light the way pewter catches it, dully and deeply both at once. Its eyes were amber, the exact amber of pine resin, held up to the sun, and they held an intelligence that was not quite the intelligence of a dog that belonged to something older and less domesticated. It was part wolf, more than part possibly. It stood perfectly still and looked at Wren with the focused attention of an animal that has made a decision and is waiting to see if the other party will cooperate. Rufus came around the front of the wagon, saw the animal, and reached for a stick without breaking stride. Wren said no. She said it quietly and without looking at Rufus, her eyes still on the animal. Then she moved slowly, lowering herself to one knee on the cold ground beside the trough, bringing herself to the animal's eye level. She extended her right hand palm downward, fingers relaxed, and held it there. She waited. The animal looked at her hand. It looked at her face. It tilted its large head slightly to the left in a way that suggested it was processing something, running some internal calculation that had more variables in it than most calculations. Then it moved. It walked directly to her unhurried and without any of the tentative approach behavior of an uncertain animal, and pressed the broad flat of its skull against her open palm. She felt the warmth of it, the weight of it, the specific steadiness of an animal that knows what it wants and has decided to want it without apology. She is choosing us. Wren said not to Rufus and not to her brother, who had climbed down from the wagon and was standing several feet away, watching with an expression caught between alarm and reluctant fascination. "We cannot take a wild animal," Colt said. Wren looked up at him from her kneeling position, her hand still against the animal's head. "She is not wild," she said. "She is alone. There is a difference." Colt looked at the animal. The animal looked at Colt. Whatever assessment passed between them in that moment was not one Colt won decisively, because after a few seconds the animal looked away, back to Wren, and Colt let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and said nothing more. When they climbed back into the wagon, the animal jumped up behind them without hesitation and settled at Wren's feet with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had already decided where it lived and was simply getting on with the business of living there. Rufus shook his head. He said nothing. Wren named her Sage. The gray of her coat was the gray of sage in winter. She explained to Colt the specific gray of something that is alive, but has learned to look like it is not, which is its own kind of intelligence. Colt accepted this without comment. He had understood since approximately the first hour of the wagon journey that the dog was coming with them, and that understanding this was a more efficient use of his energy than continuing to object. Sage settled into the journey with the ease of something that had been waiting for exactly this, and had not doubted it would come. She communicated in a register below bark, a vocabulary of small sounds and precise stillnesses that Wren began to parse within the first day as fluently as she had ever parsed anything. A low sound in the throat meant something was wrong. A soft sound higher meant she was content. A particular stillness, a suspension of her usual attentive movement, meant she was listening to something that the humans around her could not yet hear. She would prove useful in this way later. Cinder Falls came into view on a cold afternoon in late April, and it was smaller than either of them had imagined. A single unpaved main street rutted from wagon wheels and still carrying the mud of the spring thaw in the low places. A general store with a painted sign that had been fading since sometime in the previous decade. A blacksmith shop. A saloon with swinging doors that moved in the wind without being pushed. A small church with a wooden steeple that had been whitewashed recently enough to still look intentional. Perhaps 30 buildings in total, half of them, with the unfinished quality of structures built in a hurry by people who had more optimism than time. Mountains rose to the west, snow still on the peaks, the kind of white that looked cold, even from a distance. The air smelled of pine and horse and dust and that sharp, faint, medicinal quality she had noticed 2 days ago and still could not name. She noticed it was stronger here, closer to whatever it was. Rufus stopped the wagon in front of the general store and pointed at it without speaking. Colt paid the remaining balance while Wren gathered her small bag, and Sage jumped down and stood on the street, her amber eyes moving across the buildings with the patient, systematic attention of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is learning it. The general store was dim and dense with goods, the way frontier stores always were. Everything necessary stacked as efficiently as possible because the space had to serve everything a person might need within 100 miles. Barrels of flour and sugar, tools hanging from ceiling hooks, bolts of faded fabric, canned goods on shelves that reached to the rafters, the smell of leather and lantern oil, and something sweet underneath it all. Something that reminded Wren of dried herbs, though she could not locate the source. Behind the counter stood a man of about 60 with a gray beard and sharp blue eyes that moved to them the moment the door opened. He had the look of a man who had been standing in approximately this spot for 20 years watching approximately this door, and had seen enough of what came through it to have an opinion ready before anyone spoke. Silas Fenn, the store owner of Cinder Falls for 23 years. He assessed them in 2 seconds flat and arrived at a conclusion that showed itself in the slight shift of his expression before either of them had opened their mouths. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not quite a question. Colt said they were looking for the Ashford property. He corrected himself. The Callaway property. Their uncle had left them land nearby. Silas Fenn looked at them for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not the small contained sound of a man who finds something mildly amusing. It was the full-bodied laugh of a man who has been handed the most obvious joke of the year and cannot help himself, a laugh that built from a chuckle to something that bent him forward over the counter, with his hands braced on the wood and tears forming at the outer corners of his eyes. 2 other men in the store, a farmhand near the hardware section and an older man by the window. Both looked over and then looked at each other and then started laughing too. The secondary laughter of people who don't know the specific joke but recognize the shape of it. Fen straightened, eventually wiping his eyes with the back of one hand. "The Callaway place," he said, still with the residue of it in his voice. "Lord above." He looked at them both, at Colt's squared shoulders and at Wren standing one step behind her brother, at Sage sitting at Wren's feet, with her amber eyes fixed on Fenn's face in a way that had apparently not yet registered as significant to him. "You two are the heirs." "We are," Colt said. His voice was flat and even. Fenn shook his head. 23 years I've run this store," he said, "and I will tell you straight that land is not land. That is a punishment from God for sins committed in a previous life. Your Uncle God, rest him, spent 15 years proving it." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss," he added, though his tone suggested the loss he was sorrier about was their decision to come here. Wren stepped forward. Sage moved with her one smooth step, and Fenn's eyes dropped to the wolf dog for just a moment before coming back up. "Where is it?" Wren said. Her voice was calm. Not the careful calm of someone suppressing emotion, but the natural calm of someone to whom this particular room contained nothing threatening. Fenn looked at her. Whatever he saw made the tail end of his smile fade a fraction. "East," he said. "Follow the main road past the Grantley Ranch. Take the fork toward the ridges. You'll see the stone formations. You can't miss them. The Callaway cabin is wedged between the two largest." He paused again. "Your uncle died out there alone. You know that." "We know," Wren said. "And you're still going." "We're still going." Fenn studied her for another moment. He did not laugh again. He looked at her the way you look at something that does not match the category you have assigned it to, and you know the category is probably still right, but you are not quite as certain as you were 30 seconds ago. "Suit yourselves," he said. "When winter comes and you've had enough, come see me. I'll give you a fair price for whatever's left of the place." Wren did not answer. She turned and walked out of the store. Colt followed her. Behind them through the door, they heard Fenn say something to the men in the store. Then laughter again, familiar and complete, the laughter of people who already know how a story ends. Wren walked to the wagon they had hired from Rufus to carry their trunk, and she looked east, toward where the ridges began at the edge of the valley, faint in the afternoon light, the stone formations just visible as irregular shapes against the sky. She looked at them for a moment. Sage stood beside her, both of them looking in the same direction. Then she picked up her bag and started walking. Flint Rock Ridge was everything Silas Fenn had promised, and considerably worse. They walked for 2 hours past the last ranch, following a track that narrowed to a path, and then to nothing, the grassland giving way to low rises. The low rises giving way to sandstone ridges that rose 30 and 40 feet from the ground in formations that looked almost deliberate, as if something had arranged them, arches and columns and flat-top and formations casting long shadows in the lowering afternoon light. The wind came through the gaps between the ridges with a sound unlike anything Wren had heard before. It was not the wind of an open plain which moved freely and dissipated. This wind was channeled and compressed by the stone, and it came through the narrow gaps at speed high and sustained 30 miles an hour or more, gusting higher, pulling at their clothes and their hair, and making conversation something that required effort rather than ease. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, redirected by the stone formations, until it had no single direction left, only presence. Nothing grew here. Not really. No trees worth the name. No grass except in sheltered patches in the low places between formations. The ground between the ridges was pale rock and dust, and the occasional wind-scoured depression where something might have tried to take hold and thought better of it. Except for the bushes. She saw them as they came through a gap between two of the larger formations, and she stopped walking. They were low-growing, knee-high at most, with thorny stems and leaves that were dark and thick, almost leathery, and they grew in clusters at the base of the ridges and in the cracks between rock faces wherever the stone offered even partial shelter from the wind. The blossoms were small and pale yellow, barely visible among the dark leaves, and they gave off a scent that carried even over the constant wind, faint and warm and complex. A scent of camphor, and something sweeter underneath it, and something medicinal underneath that. And there were bees, dozens of them, fat and purposeful, moving between the yellow blossoms with an intensity that stopped her completely because it was wrong. Not wrong in the way of something disturbing, but wrong in the way of something that doesn't fit the expected picture. You did not expect to find bees of this density and health on a ridge where nothing grew. You did not expect to find them working with this kind of concentrated efficiency in a place that by every visible measure had no business supporting them. Unless the visible measure was wrong, unless the thing that supported them was exactly what was sitting in every sheltered crack in every rock formation around her, the clusters of thorny, dark-leaf bushes that no one in Cinder Falls had apparently looked at closely enough to wonder about. She walked toward the nearest cluster. Colt said something behind her. She did not hear it because she was already kneeling beside the base of the formation, her eyes on the ground, where the rock met the dirt, her hands moving carefully through the scattered debris at the base of the bush. She found it in the second crack she checked, small as a child's fingernail, golden with a wowy, translucent quality that caught the last of the afternoon light in a way that made it look like it was producing light rather than reflecting it. It sat in a crevice between two flat stones as if it had been placed there deliberately, which it had not. Which was the point because it sat there the way things sit when the wind has carried them and the stone has caught them, and the only intelligence involved was the intelligence of the plant that produced them, and the wind that moved them, and the stone that kept them. She picked it up between her thumb and forefinger. She held it for a moment looking at it. Then she placed it against the flat stone beside the crack and pressed down with the pad of her thumb until it split. The smell reached her before she had fully registered what she had done. Rich and warm and sharp all at once, with a depth that sat at the back of the nasal cavity and stayed there, the kind of smell that announces itself as significant before you have worked out why, the kind of smell that belongs to a specific category of things that are more valuable than they look. She knew it immediately. She had smelled it perhaps 6 times in her life, always from a small locked cabinet in her mother's treatment room, always on the rare occasions when Matilda opened the cabinet for a patient whose need was serious enough to justify the expense. Golden seal resin, her mother had called it, from the Appalachians. $6 an ounce, sometimes more depending on the year and the supplier. Too expensive to use except for the worst cases wounds that would not close, infections that had gone too deep for ordinary treatment. Miraculous, Matilda had said once, not as a figure of speech. Actually miraculous the way a very few things in the natural world were actually miraculous if you understood what they were doing. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at her thumb. The resin had left a faint golden residue on the skin. She looked at the bushes. She looked at the bees. She looked at the ridge walls around her, all the cracks and crevices and sheltered places, all the places where the dark-leafed bushes had taken hold, and all the places where the golden pods had collected in the angles between stones, where the wind slowed but did not stop. She looked at the land her uncle had spent 15 years on. She understood Phineas Calloway completely in that moment. She understood the note, and she understood why he had been afraid, and she understood what he had been trying to protect. Colt had come up beside her. He had been saying something for the past several minutes, and she had not been hearing it, and he had stopped because he had long ago learned that this was the more efficient response to his sister in a state of focused attention. "What is that?" he said, looking at the residue on her thumb. She stood up. She said, "It is resin, the kind that Mother kept locked in her cabinet, the kind that came from the Appalachians and cost $6 an ounce, and that she could never afford to use except for the most serious cases." She pointed at the dark-leafed bushes with their pale yellow flowers. "Those plants produce it," she said. "The wind dries the air and concentrates the nectar. The bees are not confused, Colt. They are thriving. This is the richest foraging ground in this entire valley, and no one in Cinder Falls has any idea what they are looking at." Colt stared at the bushes. He stared at her. He said, "You cannot know that. You cannot know any of that from smelling a piece of residue the size of your thumbnail." She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at problems that were large but not complicated. Directly and without impatience, because impatience was a waste. "I know it," she said, the way Mother knew things. The way she could look at a plant and understand what it was for before she had finished looking. Uncle Phineas was not mad. He was the only person on this ridge who looked at what was actually here instead of what he expected to find. Colt was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between the formations and made its high-channeled sound. The bees continued their work in the yellow blossoms, unhurried and certain, doing what they had apparently been doing on this ridge for decades, for reasons no one who lived in the settlement 6 miles west had thought to investigate. Then Colt said, 6 months. Give us 6 months before I form any other opinions about this. It was not what she had asked for. She had not asked for anything, but she heard in it what it was, which was her brother deciding to follow her into a place he did not yet understand on the basis of a trust that had been built over years of watching her be right about things he couldn't see. She turned to look at the cabin. It was exactly where Silas Fenn had said it would be, wedged into the gap between two of the larger ridge formations, built from the same pale sandstone as the ridges themselves, so that it sat in the gap the way a keystone sits in an arch placed rather than constructed. One room, a door that hung at an angle on leather hinges dried to cracking, a roof that had partially collapsed on the western side, the stones pulling apart where the mortar had failed, a single window opening with no glass, just the cold air moving through it freely. Inside, a bed frame with a rotted mattress, a cast iron stove with a crust of old rust on every surface, a wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, compensated by a folded piece of leather wedged under it, dust over everything, the faint smell of something that had been organic once and was no longer. And in the wall beside the stove, a place where one of the stones was set differently from the others, slightly proud of the surface, not mortared the same way as if it had been moved and replaced more than once by hands that knew exactly which stone it was. Wren noticed it. She filed it and moved on. There was a more immediate problem. "We cannot sleep here tonight," Colt said, looking at the collapsed western wall of the roof through which the late afternoon sky was visible in a rough triangle. She was already outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin, with her hand trailing the stones, feeling where her uncle had fitted them, understanding from the way they were joined that he had done this work himself without assistance, which took skill and time and a particular kind of patience that was its own form of knowledge. "He built this himself," she said. "These stones are cut and fitted without mortar in the load-bearing sections. That takes skill." "Skill doesn't help if the roof falls on us," Colt said. She came around the back of the cabin to the southern face where the formation offered the most shelter from the prevailing wind and stood with her back against the warm stone. The sun had been on this face all afternoon, and the rock held the heat of it, stored and gentle, warmer than the air around it by several degrees. Sage came and sat beside her. The ridge was not dying. The ridge was not empty. The ridge was doing exactly what it had been doing for however many decades. The goldthorn bushes had been rooted in these crevices, and the bees had been working these blossoms, and the wind had been carrying the resin pods into the sheltered angles of the stone where they accumulated like small golden coins, dropped by something that had better things to do than count them. What the ridge was unseen, and what Phineas Calloway had tried to tell them in 6 cramped and urgent words on yellowed paper was simple. He had seen it, and whatever had happened to him because he had seen it, he wanted them to see it too. She would understand what had happened to him later. She would find his words again in a place he had prepared for her to find them, and those words would change what she understood about this land, and about the man who had claimed it, and about the danger she was standing at the edge of without knowing it yet. But that was later. For now she stood with her back against warm stone and her face in the wind, and Sage a warm weight against her left leg, and the smell of goldthorn resin faint in the cold air around her, and she knew what her uncle had known, and what no one in Cinder Falls had been willing to look long enough to see. This land was not worthless. This land was exactly the opposite of worthless. She was still working out the precise dimensions of what that meant when she heard the horses. 3 of them. Coming from the west, moving at a pace that was not casual and not urgent, but deliberate, the pace of people who have somewhere specific to go and have decided in advance what they will say when they get there. The man in front was on a black horse that was worth more than everything Colt and Wren Calloway owned in total. He was broad and sun-darkened with a thick gray mustache and eyes the color of slate, flat and even, and giving nothing away. He wore good clothes, not the clothes of a man who wore good clothes for special occasions, but the clothes of a man for whom good clothes were simply the default, the baseline of how he presented himself to the world, because the world owed him a baseline of respect, and he was going to establish it in every register available to him. He stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing in front of the cabin. The 2 men behind him stopped as well. None of them dismounted. Harlan Voss. He owned Ironwood Ranch, 4,100 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. His cattle numbered in the thousands. His word was the nearest thing to law in Cinder Falls, and for 20 miles in every direction, and he was the kind of man who was aware of this and had structured his life accordingly so that the awareness reinforced itself at every turn. He looked at the cabin, he looked at the stone repairs that Wren had been running her hands over. He looked at Colt, and then he looked at Wren, and something in the way he looked at her shifted the quality of his attention slightly, not dramatically, not in a way he would have named, but enough that she noticed. "You are the Calloway heirs," he said. It was not a question. "We are," Colt said. Voss nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who has been told something he already knew. "Your uncle," he said, "was a fool. He spent 15 years on this ground, talking to himself and building walls for no purpose that anyone could see. He died out here alone. I want you to understand that before we continue." He paused. "I'm prepared to offer you $75 for this property. Cash today. That is enough to get you back to wherever you came from and give you a start." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope and held it in two fingers extended toward them. Colt looked at Wren. Wren did not look at her brother. She looked at Harlan Voss. "No," she said. One word. Clean and quiet, carrying nothing extra. The two men behind Voss shifted in their saddles. Not threatening, just shifting the movement of men who have learned to pay attention when a situation starts to go differently than expected. Voss looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has not been told no very often and is deciding how he feels about it. "I don't believe I was speaking to you specifically," he said. Wren stepped forward. Sage stepped with her, matching her movement, exactly one smooth, unhurried step. "This land is not for sale," Wren said. "Not for $75. Voss looked down at her from the height of the black horse. He looked at the wolf dog at her side. He looked at her face, at the quality of her stillness, which was the stillness of someone who has already finished the argument and is simply waiting for the other person to understand that it is over. "You don't know what you have here, girl," he said. "This land grows nothing. It supports nothing. Your uncle wasted 15 years proving that fact, and the winter here will finish the argument he started. My Uncle Wren said knew exactly what he had, and so do I." The smile that moved across Voss's face then did not reach his slate-gray eyes. It was the smile of a man who has already decided on the next move and is performing patience for reasons of his own. "You have until September," he said. "Then I'll send my people to discuss this in terms you'll find more persuasive." He pulled the black horse around and rode west. The two men behind him followed without looking back. Colt waited until the sound of the hooves had faded into the ridge formations. Then he turned to his sister and said, "You just made an enemy of the most powerful man in this territory." Wren was looking at the place where the horses had been at the dusk, still settling in the still air of the clearing. "He was already our enemy," she said. "He just hadn't said so yet." She turned back to the cabin. She looked at the collapsed western section of the roof, and then at the stone formations around them, and at the gold thorn bushes in their clusters along the base of the ridge, and at the bees still moving between the pale yellow blossoms in the fading light, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing important had changed, because from where the bees stood, nothing had. She looked at the wall beside the stove, at the stone that sat differently from the others. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Sage, who was watching the gap where the horses had disappeared, with an expression that Wren was already beginning to read as something between alertness and memory. "There is work to do," Wren said. She went inside. The first morning after Harlan Voss rode away, Wren Calloway was up before the sun. Not because she could not sleep, though the bed frame with its rotted mattress was not an invitation to sleep. Because there was work to do, and the work had a sequence, and the sequence had to begin somewhere, and the place it had to begin was with understanding exactly what she had. She walked the ridge at first light when the wind was at its lowest, the specific stillness that came to Flint Rock in the hour before sunrise when the temperature differential between the stone and the air above it dropped enough that the pressure systems paused and the formations stood silent, and the only sound was her own footsteps on the pale sandstone and Sage moving beside her. The wolf dog's paws finding the rock surfaces with the quiet precision of something that had always known how to move without making unnecessary noise. She carried her mother's notebook. The smallest of the three she had packed, half filled with Matilda's cramped observations in German and English, mixed together the way her mother's thinking mixed them, the language that held the words she needed arriving before the language she was supposed to be using. She had brought a pencil sharpened to a fine point, and she used it now, stopping at each cluster of goldthorn bushes along the base of the ridges and kneeling and making notes. She counted 14 clusters on their property. The largest grew along the southern ridge, face protected from the worst of the prevailing wind by a natural curve in the stone that created a pocket of relative calm, and in this pocket the plants were tallest and darkest, and the concentration of resin pods in the sheltered angles of the rock was highest. She noted the orientation of each cluster relative to the sun, the depth of the soil at the base of each root system, where she could probe it with a stick, the presence and behavior of bees at each location. The bees were everywhere, not in the desperate scattered way of insects working poor forage, but in the dense purposeful way of something working abundance. They moved between the pale yellow blossoms and streams, their leg baskets heavy with pollen. Their flight paths direct and efficient, the flight paths of bees that know exactly where they are going and have no reason to hesitate. She found their hives in the crevices of the rock faces, wild colonies that had been working these blossoms for what looked like decades, the wax of old comb visible in the deeper cracks as dark strata layer on layer, year on year, a geological record of honey production in a place where nobody had thought to look. She noted all of this and thought about what it meant, and then she went back to the cabin, where Colt was heating water for coffee on the cast iron stove that worked better than it looked, and she sat at the table with the short leg and the piece of folded leather, and she told him what she had found. He listened. He was good at listening when she needed him to, which was one of the things she valued most about her brother, the understanding that her information was worth taking in before responding to. When she finished, he said, 14 clusters, and you want to map them all. Already done, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He said, what do we do with the mapping? She pulled the notebook toward him and showed him the diagram she had drawn, the ridge formations in rough outline with the 14 cluster locations marked and numbered and annotated with their relative size and sun exposure and resin concentration. She showed him the natural collection points, the angles of stone where the wind slowed enough to deposit the fallen resin pods rather than carry them away. Uncle Phineas, she said, had laid a row of flat stones along the base of the southern ridge. She had noticed them the previous evening. They looked like they might have been the foundation of something he planned to build. They were not. They were a collection system. He had placed them to create additional sheltered angles where the pods would accumulate rather than scatter. He understood it, she said. He just didn't have anyone to help him make it work. Colt looked at the diagram. He was 19 years old and had spent 5 years operating heavy industrial machinery, and his mind worked well with systems, with the logic of how things moved and where the efficiencies were and what the failure points looked like before they failed. He looked at the ridge diagram and he saw what she was seeing, and then he looked up. The low stone walls, he said, around the clusters, not high enough to block the wind completely, just enough to slow it. She nodded. The pods collect where the wind slows but doesn't stop. She tapped 2 locations on the diagram, here and here. If we build walls curved to follow the formation, we create pockets. More collection surface, more pods per cluster per week. He looked at the ridge outside the window. She could see him planning the construction in his mind, selecting stones, calculating the courses, working out the angles. That is several weeks of work, he said. We have the summer, she said. He drank his coffee. He said, then we start today. They started that morning and they did not stop. Colt cut and fitted stone with his hands, selecting pieces from the scattered talus at the base of the formations and fitting them without mortar, the way his uncle had fitted the cabin walls, course by course, curving the walls to follow the natural contours of the ridge face. It was slow work and heavy work, and he did it without complaint, the way he did most physical things, with a steady application of effort that did not peak and did not flag. The walls took most of June to build. While he built, Wren worked the goldthorn itself. She harvested the resin pods in the early morning when the temperature was lowest and the pods had hardened overnight and came free from the crevices cleanly, rather than smearing. She collected them in small canvas pouches and stored them in a wooden box she built herself from scrap lumber, salvaged from the collapsed section of the cabin roof, sealed with a strip of hide along the lid, kept in the coolest corner of the interior, where the rock face stayed shadowed all day. She built the hive boxes from the same salvaged lumber, 6 of them more rectangular structures with removable lids and narrow entrance slots. She built them the way her mother had described building them once in a story about a beekeeper in Bavaria who had shown Matilda how wild swarms could be encouraged into prepared structures if the structures were placed with the right orientation and the right shelter and the right timing. Wren placed each box in the most sheltered position she had identified in her mapping, weighting them against the wind with stacked stones, orienting the entrance slots away from the prevailing weather. She waited. By the end of June, 4 of the 6 boxes had been occupied by wild swarms that arrived over the course of 2 weeks, finding the prepared structures and moving in with the matter-of-fact efficiency of bees that have been looking for exactly this and recognize it when they see it. Sage watched all of this from various positions on the ridge, moving from shadow to shadow, through the heat of the days, her amber eyes following Wren, the way water follows the lowest course constantly and without apparent effort. She had claimed the large flat stone south of the cabin as her primary observation post, and from there she could see the full sweep of the ridge and the approach from the west and the gap between the two largest formations that was the only practical entry to the property from the direction of Cinder Falls. She never barked. She communicated in smaller registers, a shift in her posture, a tilt of her head, a low sound that Wren had learned to parse as reliably as any spoken language. Twice in June, she signaled before riders came through the western gap. Both times it was men from the Ironwood Ranch passing slowly, not stopping looking at the stone walls Colt was building, and the hive boxes on the southern ridge face and the two young people going about their work without acknowledging the inspection. They were not subtle about the looking. They were not meant to be. Wren noted the visits in the notebook. She noted the direction they came from and the direction they went. She noted what they looked at longest. She did not stop working. By August, the hive boxes were doing what hive boxes did when they were correctly placed and correctly managed, which was produce. She could see the bees returning in the late afternoons with their leg baskets packed, could hear the change in the hive sound as the honey frames filled, could tell by pressing her palm against the wooden side of each box what was happening inside the sustained warmth of a healthy colony at work. Thousands of small bodies generating heat through movement and purpose. She had collected 38 ounces of resin pods by the end of August, stored and cataloged in the sealed wooden box. She did not know exactly what that represented in dollar terms. She knew what her mother had paid occasionally for small quantities of lesser quality from an herbalist supplier in Cincinnati who got it through a middleman in Philadelphia. She knew it was not a small number. She did not say this to Cole. She did not say it to herself in any form that would make it real before she had confirmed it. She had her mother's discipline about premature conclusions, the understanding that the value of something was not established until someone with the means to purchase it had looked at it and said a number out loud. There were things to do before that could happen. The cabin roof was repaired by the end of July, Colt working section by section with the salvaged lumber and the additional stones he hauled from the talus field. The door hung straight on new leather hinges he had cut and shaped himself. The window opening had stretched hide over it, not glass, but better than the open air. The cast iron stove cleared of its rust with river sand, and a flat stone heated the interior space more efficiently than its size suggested it should, which she understood was because of the way her uncle had fitted the cabin into the formation gap, with the stone walls of the ridge itself forming 2 of the 4 sides and holding the heat the way deep stone always held heat. Phineas had been smart. He had been looking as she was now, learning to look at what was actually there rather than at what he expected to find. She thought about him often in those summer months. She thought about what it must have been like to find this ridge and understand it and have no one to tell, to work alone year after year on something no one else could see. She thought about the note, the urgency of the handwriting, the 6 words that said everything and explained nothing because there had not been time to explain, and he had known it. She thought about these things, and she worked, and she did not yet know how right she was about the urgency. The fire came on a Tuesday night in early September. She did not hear it first. Sage heard it or sensed it, some change in the air pressure or the smell of the night that registered in the wolf dog system before any human instrument could have caught it. Wren woke to Sage's voice, not the low register she used for the riders from Ironwood, but something higher and sharper and insistent, the sound of something that could not wait. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Colt was already at the door. Through the gaps in the stretched hide on the window, there was a color that did not belong to a September night on the ridge. Orange, pulsing directional. coming from the north. They ran. The fire had started in the dry grass of the draw between the northern formation and the property boundary, and it was moving south with the night wind behind it, moving the way fire moves when it has good fuel, in a consistent direction, not erratically but with a horrible patient advancing certainty. The flames were 10 feet high in the tallest places, generating their own wind, now pulling air toward themselves from every direction and feeding it back out as heat. 4 of the goldthorn clusters were directly in its path. So were 4 of the hive boxes. She saw Colt register the hive boxes at the same moment she did, and she saw him do the calculation, and she saw him make the wrong decision. Not wrong in terms of his values, which were not wrong. Wrong in terms of the outcome, which she could not change because he was already moving. He ran directly toward the nearest hive box. She screamed his name. He did not stop. He reached the hive 60 feet from the leading edge of the fire and grabbed the box with both hands and pulled. The fire had not yet reached it, but the radiant heat at that distance was a wall of physical pressure, and she could see from where she stood that the near edge of the box was already beginning to darken. He dragged it backward 10 feet 20, set it down, turned back toward the fire. She was running toward him. He reached the second box just as the flames found it. She saw it happen. She saw the fire touch the wood of the box, and she saw her brother's hands close on the sides of it, and she saw him pull, and the fire came with his hands. Both of them. From wrist to elbow, the inside face of both forearms, the specific and merciless contact of open flame with skin. He did not let go. He pulled the box clear, dragging it away from the advancing line, and set it down and stepped back, and stood looking at his arms with an expression that was not pain, yet because the nervous system takes a moment to deliver that particular report, and in that moment he simply looked at what had happened to his hands and forearms with a kind of removed clarity. Then the pain arrived and he went to his knees. She was beside him. Her hands went to his arms instinctively, and she stopped herself before she touched the burned surfaces, because touching would make it worse, and she knew that. She looked at what was there. The skin from wrist to elbow on both arms had gone the particular red-white of a serious burn, already beginning to blister in the places where the contact had been longest, the inside surfaces where the skin was thinnest. Sage appeared beside her, pressing against Wren's leg, her amber eyes on Colt's face. The fire moved past them to the south, taking the 4 clusters and the 2 remaining hive boxes in the wooden storage structure where she had kept the backup supply of dried herbs and the entire spring's collection of resin pods that she had packed for separate storage against the fire risk she had not taken seriously enough. It burned through in 40 minutes and found the bare rock of the southern formation and stopped. The smoke afterwards smelled of gold thorn resin, the same warm medicinal smell she had known from her mother's locked cabinet now spread across the entire northern face of the ridge in the cold night air. She sat beside her brother and looked at his arms and looked at the smoldering ruin of 4 months of work. The nearest doctor was in Cheyenne, 2 days by horse, which they did not have. 3 days by the wagon she could hire from the relay station 4 miles west, which would cost money they barely had, and more than that, which would leave the property unguarded for the 3 days of going, and however long the doctor kept them in the 3 days back. She knew what Harlan Voss would do with an unguarded property. She did not know how she knew this with the certainty she had, but she knew it the way she knew the wind direction from the sound it made in the stone formations, the way she knew the state of a hive from the warmth against the wood. Some things did not require a complete explanation to be understood completely. The fever would come. For burns of this severity, the fever always came within 48 hours of the initial injury, the body's response to the insult of damaged tissue, and once it came without treatment, it would climb. She looked at her brother's arms in the firelight of the small camp she had built away from the smoldering remains of the northern field. She looked at the canvas pouch in her coat pocket, the one she always kept with her because she could not bear to let the samples out of her sight. There were 11 resin pods in it. She had weighed them that morning, roughly half an ounce. Her mother had said golden seal resin could heal wounds faster than anything else she had in her cabinet. Had said it quietly the way Matilda said things she was absolutely certain of, without emphasis, as if the certainty itself was emphasis enough. Had said she had never been able to use it properly because she could never afford enough. had said once in the specific privacy of a late evening when the work was done and the children were supposedly asleep, and Matilda thought she was alone, that if she ever had access to a proper supply of it, she thought she could do things she had not been able to do. Wren had been 8 years old and lying very still in the dark and absorbing every word. She was 17 now, and her brother's arms were burned to the inside of the elbow, and the fever was coming, and the nearest doctor was 2 days away, and she had half an ounce of the substance her mother had called miraculous. She pressed the heel of her hand flat against the packed earth of the clearing floor and felt the cold of it and thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what the difference between them cost her. She had never used it on a person. She had used it on a cut on her own hand in June, a deep one from a sharp edge of sandstone, and had watched the wound close and seal in a way that had not surprised her exactly, but had confirmed something she had been holding as theoretical. She had one data point, which was herself, and one data point was not enough to constitute certainty, but she was the only resource available on this ridge tonight. And she had been trained for 17 years by the most careful and knowledgeable person she had ever known, and the knowledge her mother had given her was not approximate or general, but specific and deep and aimed, and it had been aimed. She understood this now in a way she could not have articulated before this moment at exactly this kind of situation. The situation where there was no doctor, where there was only what grew nearby and what you knew about it, and whether you trusted both enough to act. She took the canvas pouch from her coat pocket. She found two flat stones from the fire perimeter and used one as a surface and the other as a grinder, and she worked the resin pods into a fine powder, fine enough that there were no remaining visible pieces, only a pale golden dust that smelled of everything her mother's locked cabinet had ever smelled of. She mixed it with honey from the one surviving hive, working the combination on the flat stone until it was consistent, a golden paste that was warm and faintly transparent and smelled of camphor and wildflower, and something else she did not have a name for but recognized as medicinal in the deep, specific way of things that work. She looked at her brother's arms. She said his name, and he looked at her, and she began. She did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch for 20 days. She changed the dressings twice a day, grinding fresh resin each time, mixing it with honey, applying it in thin, even layers, the way her mother had taught her to apply any topical treatment. Not pressing, but laying, not cold, but body temperature warm between her palms first. She kept the stove running through the nights and the days, the cabin warm and consistent, because her mother had said that a body-fighting infection was a body spending everything it had on one battle and needed every other variable held steady. The fever came on the second day. It arrived the way bad fevers arrived, not gradually, but definitively, the temperature climbing through the afternoon of the second day and into the third and peaking on the fifth day, in a place that frightened her in the part of her that she did not allow to be visible. Colt's skin was hot enough to feel from 3 inches away. He did not recognize her when she spoke. He spoke in fragments, sometimes in English and sometimes in German words she half remembered from their mother's speech. Childhood words, the words a person went back to when the surface layer had burned away. He called for their mother. She held his hand and did not cry. She did not cry because she needed everything she had for the work, and the work required clarity, and grief was not clarity. There would be time for grief if the worst happened. She did not allow herself to think about the worst happening with any specificity, because specificity would make it a plan rather than a fear, and she refused to plan for failure. Sage stayed on the floor beside the bed, her chin on her front paws, her amber eyes on Colt's face, moving occasionally to follow his breathing. She left twice a day to eat and returned immediately. Whatever she understood about what was happening, her understanding expressed itself as proximity. On the sixth day, the fever began to break. Not quickly, not dramatically. It retreated the way it had advanced in increments, the skin temperature dropping through the afternoon and the night, the breathing steadying, the random speech becoming less frequent and then stopping. On the 10th day, Colt opened his eyes and knew where he was and who was beside him, and asked for water in a voice that was rough and thin, but his own. On the 20th day, he sat up and looked at his arms. The skin was new, pink and tight and tender, with a fragility that she knew would last for weeks, and across both forearms, a pattern of pale lines that were not quite scars, more like the faint maps of rivers seen from above the record of where the fire had been. But the skin was whole. It had closed and sealed without infection, without the black edges that would have meant tissue death, without the signs of systemic failure that she had been watching for every hour of the 20 days. She had not used all of the resin. She had used a third of what she had carefully in precise measured applications because she understood that this substance was not infinite and that waste in medicine was the same as ignorance. Colt looked at his arms for a long time. "You saved me," he said. She was at the window looking at the ridge where the northern face still showed the blackened ground of the fire, and the gold thorn clusters that had been there were ash, and the work of 4 months was gone. "Gold thorn saved you," she said. "I just knew how to use it, because of everything Mother taught me." He was quiet. She heard him settle back against the wall behind the bed, the sound of a man taking stock of the distance between where he had been and where he now was. "I will never doubt you again," he said. She did not answer, but she felt something release in her shoulders, a tension she had been carrying since the night of the fire, and she breathed once slowly and let it go. She had work to do. They both did. And the summer was spent, and the fall was coming, and the winter behind it, and they were going to have to survive it with less than she had planned. The first snow fell in the last week of October. She was not ready. She was closer to ready than most people would have managed from the starting point of September, with the burned ground and the lost resin, and Colt still moving carefully to protect the new skin on his forearms. But she was not ready in the way she needed to be, and she knew it, and she made the adjustments she could make and accepted the limitations she could not change and went to work. She learned to work in shifts determined by the temperature and the wind. When the wind was below 15 miles an hour, she could work outside for 30 minutes before her hands lost the fine motor control she needed. When it gusted higher, 20 minutes. When the temperature dropped below zero, 10 minutes, and sometimes the 10 minutes cost her more than they returned. Her hands cracked at the knuckles despite the oiled leather wrappings she made from an old belt, splitting along the lines between the bones, where the skin pulled tightest small wounds that would not fully close until April. Cole kept the fire burning and the food prepared, and the cabin warmed, the reversal of their summer arrangement, his arms still healing, still requiring the careful management of new skin. He was not idle. He was planning. In the evenings when the wind made the formations speak in their high-channeled register, he sat at the table with the notebook and made drawings of the stone walls he would build in the spring, wider and better angled, incorporating everything he had learned from watching where the resin pods had accumulated before the fire. They ate beans and salt pork every day because they could afford nothing else and because variety was not the priority. The priority was survival across a specific number of months, and everything that did not contribute to that survival was a cost they could not carry. There were nights when it was very hard. There was one night in particular. She had woken at 3 in the morning to check the hive boxes as she did every other night through the winter, pressing her palm against the wood to feel the warmth of the colony inside the faint vibration of thousands of bees, keeping themselves alive through the cold by the collective heat of their own bodies. The temperature that night was 15 below zero. The wind was coming through the ridge gaps at perhaps 25 miles an hour, creating a cold that had no fair description in the language of people who had not stood in it. The sky was completely clear. She had never seen stars like this. In Cincinnati, the city's light had washed the sky to a uniform dark gray in which perhaps 40 stars were visible on the clearest night. Here at 15 below zero on a Wyoming ridge in January, the stars were not points, but presences dense beyond counting, spread across the black, from horizon to horizon, with a profusion that looked almost intentional. The cold made the air so dry that there was no scatter, no softening, only the stars themselves and the absolute silence between them. The wind passing through ice that had formed in the rock crevices made a sound she had no reference for. High and thin and sustained, almost harmonic, as if the ridge formations were an instrument being played by something that understood their resonant frequencies. She stood in this with her palm against the nearest hive and felt the warmth of the colony inside and looked at the sky and thought about her mother. Not about her death, about her life, about the specific quality of her mother's knowledge and attention, the way Matilda had moved through the world, as if everything in it was worth understanding, as if the information available in a plant or a hive or a patient's symptom was worth the full engagement of her considerable intelligence. She had not gotten to see this ridge. She had not gotten to see what grew on it or what it could become. She had died in January in a Cincinnati apartment above a butcher shop, and she would never know what her daughter had found. Wren pressed her palm harder against the hive. "I miss you," she said to the empty sky. "I wish you could see this." The wind moved through the ice formations and made its thin harmonic sound, and somewhere below the ridge, a coyote called once and went quiet. Sage pressed against Wren's left leg, warm and solid and real. She stood there for a long time. Spring came in the way Wyoming springs came, not graciously, but grudgingly, the snow retreating in patches, and the temperature climbing and falling for weeks before it committed to anything above freezing. She found the hive boxes intact. All four surviving colonies had made it through the sealed entrances she had reduced with pebbles and clay in November, keeping enough warmth in, and cold out for the colonies to sustain themselves on their stored honey. She reopened the entrances in March and watched the first bees of the year emerge cautiously into the cold sunlight and fly a few exploratory circuits and return. She found something else in March. She was walking the southern ridge face on an early morning when the air was still and cold, and the light was the specific flat clarity of high-altitude spring, and she came to the place below the cabin wall where her uncle had laid his row of flat stones years before, and she looked at the cabin wall above them, and she saw the stone. She had noticed it before in the first hours after they arrived, had filed it and moved on. She had been moving past it all winter, sometimes several times a day, and each time she had noticed the slight proud projection of it from the wall surface, the way it was set differently from the stones around it, without the flush mortar line, as if it had been placed and removed and replaced multiple times. She stopped in front of it. She set down the notebook and the sample pouch, and she put both hands against the stone and pressed, exploring its movement the way it sat in the wall. It shifted, slightly a millimeter, no more, but it shifted with the intention of something that was meant to move. She worked it for 20 minutes, pressing and releasing, feeling the angle that gave the direction it wanted to go. Then she lifted, and the stone came free of the wall in her hands, heavier than she had expected. And behind it was a space roughly the size of a boot box, cut into the wall with the precision of someone who had done it deliberately and carefully. Inside the space was a journal, oilcloth wrapped tight the way you wrapped something you intended to keep dry for as long as possible. She unwrapped it slowly, already knowing what she was going to find before she opened the cover and confirmed it. Her uncle's handwriting, the same cramped, pressured script as the note that had started all of this. But here in a journal there was space for explanation, and Phineas Calloway had used it. She sat on the flat stone below the wall, and she read. He had kept the journal for the last 2 years of his life, beginning when he had decided as he wrote it that something had to be written down because he was no longer certain of how much time he had. He had written about the goldthorn and about his understanding of the resin and about the bees and the honey and what he believed the combination of them represented in terms of value and potential. He had written with the methodical clarity of a man who understood what he had and was trying to leave a complete record of that understanding for whoever came after him. And he had written about Harlan Voss. It began 3 years before the end of the journal with a visit from Voss that was not unlike the one she had experienced, the offer at a price designed to insult, the refusal to discuss the riding away with the specific gait of a man who has merely paused rather than stopped. It continued through increasingly frequent visits from Voss's men, the small harassments, a fence line moved, a water source fouled with ash, the kind of pressure that built slowly enough to be deniable. And then the last entry, she read it twice. They have poisoned my dog. Cooper was 12 years old and had been with me since the first year on this ridge, and he was found dead on a Monday morning, with no injury and no visible cause. In the way he died, the convulsions I observed before the end told me what the cause was. I know what arsenic poisoning looks like in a dog. I have seen it before. She looked at the formation wall in front of her for a long moment. He continued, I know what this means for me. A man who will poison a dog to send a message has already decided what the next message will be. I am writing this now because I want there to be a record. I do not know who will find this, but I know this land will eventually go to someone, and I want whoever it is to know what they are walking into. The goldthorn is real. The value of it is real. And the man who wants this land is a man who has already killed to take it from me and does not know yet that I know. The final line was this. My brother's daughter will know what to do with this. I have never met her. But Matilda's daughter will know. Wren sat with the journal in her lap for a long time. The wind came up as the morning advanced, finding the gaps in the formation and making it sound, and the sound was different from what it had been 6 months ago, less hostile, more familiar, the sound of something she had learned to read rather than something she was still learning. She did not cry. She sat in the cold morning air with her uncle's last words in her hands, and she understood what he had known and why he had been afraid and what it had cost him and what it was now asking her to know. Harlan Voss had killed her uncle. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to say it aloud. It was real in the way that things were real when you had evidence for them rather than suspicion when the record existed in someone's handwriting, and the handwriting was the handwriting of someone who had nothing to gain from lying. She thought about the question of what to do with this knowledge, not whether to act. That was settled. Phineas Calloway had spent 15 years on this ridge and had understood what was here and had died for it alone because no one had known and no one had been there to stand beside him. She was here now. She was not alone. And she had something her uncle had not had, which was time, which was the summer and the fall, and however many seasons it took to build something on this ridge that was too large and too established and too well documented to destroy quietly. Voss had sent men to look at the stone walls Colt was building. He had sent men to look at the hive boxes. He was watching them the way a patient man watched something he expected eventually to acquire at his chosen price when the two young people from Cincinnati had exhausted themselves and their resources and come to him ready to accept the number he had originally offered. She intended to be something he did not expect by the time he made that move. She wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth and placed it inside her coat against her chest. She picked up her notebook and her sample pouch. She went back to work. Spring became the summer of 1882, and the summer of 1882 became a kind of revelation. The resin production from the surviving clusters, supplemented by the collection walls Colt had finished in May, exceeded everything she had projected. The new stone walls worked exactly as she had theorized they would, slowing the wind in the sheltered pockets, without stopping it, creating the conditions in which the fallen pods accumulated, rather than scattering, and by June the canvas pouches were filling faster than she could process them. She refined her extraction technique through the summer, developing a method of controlled warming that allowed her to separate the most potent fraction of the resin from the supporting compounds, producing a concentrated material that she was certain, based on everything her mother had taught her and everything she had observed in the past year, was of significantly higher quality than anything a regional supplier could have sourced from the Appalachian Range. The honey was extraordinary. She had expected good honey. The goldthorn blossoms were dense with nectar, and the colony populations were strong, and the forage area, while not extensive, was concentrated enough that the bees were producing honey that was darker and more complex than any regional varietal she had encountered. It smelled of camphor and wildflower, and something underneath both, something the goldthorn contributed that had no other name except itself. She began writing letters. She knew of one address, a medical supply house in Denver, that her mother had mentioned once as a source of botanical compounds, a house that dealt in serious quantities of serious materials for serious purposes. She wrote a careful, precise letter describing what she had, the quality of the resin and the honey, and the volume she could sustain on an annual basis, and she sent it with a small sample sealed in a tin. 3 weeks later, a man named Dr. Clement Ware arrived at Flint Rock Ridge. He was a physician from Denver, 45 years old, with the deliberate manner of someone who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing and looked at the ridge formations and the low stone walls and the hive boxes tucked into the sheltered crevices, and the two young people watching him from the cabin doorway, and his expression registered something that was not quite surprise, but was in the same family. He looked at the resin sample she had sent him. He looked at more of it, the full supply she brought out for his examination, and he took his time smelling and examining and applying a small amount to a cut on his own hand that he had gotten on the ride out, watching the result with clinical attention. He said, "I have been practicing medicine for 20 years. He said, "I have used golden seal in various forms for most of those years. He said, "I have never had access to material of this quality at any price." She told him the price. He agreed without negotiating. She stood in the clearing at Flint Rock Ridge and received his commitment to purchase her annual production at a price that made Colt, standing beside her, take a breath that was audible from 3 feet away. She did not react outwardly. She noted the number in the notebook and thanked Dr. Ware for his time and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat in the cabin with the short-legged table and talked about what he intended to do with the material and what she needed in order to maintain and expand production. He left 2 hours later with a significant portion of her current stock and a written agreement for annual purchase signed by both of them. She sat at the table after he rode away and looked at the agreement and looked at the notebook. She thought about the journal inside her coat against her chest where she still kept it most days. She thought about what Harlan Voss would do when word reached him, as it eventually would, that the two orphans on the worthless ridge had found a buyer who thought the ridge was not worthless at all. She thought about the lawsuit he would file and when he would file it and what he would need in order to file it convincingly and what she would need in order to defend against it. She pulled the notebook toward her and began writing. Not about the resin, about what she had found in the wall, about what her uncle had written, about what she knew and what she could prove, and what the difference between those two things would cost her in a courtroom in Cheyenne. She wrote until the light failed, and then she lit the lantern and kept writing. Outside, Sage moved from the flat observation stone to the cabin doorway and lay down with her chin on the threshold, watching the western gap between the formations. The wind moved through the ridge in the dark. The goldthorn held fast to the rock. The bees, sealed in their boxes for the night, kept their warmth through collective work, doing what they had always done, what they would keep doing long after the humans arguing about this ridge had finished arguing. It had taken a year and a fire and 20 days of fear to get here. There were more years ahead and more fire of one kind or another, and more fear of the kind that came with being a person who had something worth taking in the proximity of someone willing to take it. But she had the journal, and she had the Summers contracts. And she had the knowledge that her uncle had died trying to protect something real, and that the real thing was still here, still producing, still being worked by bees that had been on this ridge for decades and intended to remain. She was not going anywhere. She turned the page in the notebook and wrote the date at the top and continued. The lawsuit arrived in the spring of 1884, delivered by a clerk from a Denver law firm who rode out to Flint Rock Ridge on a Thursday morning and handed the papers to Colt with the brisk efficiency of a man who had delivered bad news often enough to have made his peace with the work. Wren read the papers at the kitchen table while the clerk waited outside. The claim was this: Harlan Voss alleged that Phineas Calloway had acquired the Flint Rock property through fraudulent means 30 years prior, using forged documents to displace Voss's father from land that had been legitimately his. The land therefore had never legally belonged to Phineas, could not have been legally transferred to his heirs, and should be recognized by the court as the rightful property of the Voss estate. The case would be heard in Cheyenne. A date was set for late summer. She set the papers down flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. She thought about the journal against her chest. She had kept it there for 2 years, the oilcloth worn soft from handling the writing inside still clear. She had read it many times, not because she needed to, she had memorized its contents in the first week, but because the reading itself felt like a responsibility, like bearing witness to something that had not been witnessed when it mattered. She went to the wall beside the stove and replaced the stone that still covered the space, even though the journal was no longer inside it. She pressed the stone flat with both palms, felt the fitted edges of it, thought about her uncle's hands doing the same thing in a different season, with a different fear behind the motion, but the same deliberateness. She pulled the stone back out. She placed the journal inside. She replaced the stone. Then she sat back down at the table and began writing the letters that needed to be written. She wrote to Dr. Clement Ware in Denver. She wrote to the medical supply house. She wrote to 3 physicians who had purchased the resin through secondary suppliers and whose names she had tracked through the careful correspondence she had maintained for 2 years. She wrote to Ezra Croft. Croft had appeared at Flint Rock in the spring of 1882, a few weeks after Dr. Ware's first visit, arriving on a gray morning on a horse that was too good for a man who dressed as simply as he did, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that moved across the ridge formations with the assessing attention of someone who bought and sold things for a living and had learned to read value in unexpected places. He was 63 years old. He had been buying and selling medicinal plants and botanical compounds for 35 years, and he had connections in St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia that represented the difference between a local market and a national one. He had tasted the resin and looked at the honey and looked at the ridge and looked at Wren, and he had said, "I have heard about you from 3 separate sources in the past month." She had said then, "You know what I have." He had said, "I know what you claim to have." She had shown him the journal. Not all of it. The sections about the gold thorn, about Phineas's understanding of the resin and the bees and the production methods he had developed over 15 years of careful observation. She had not shown him the sections about Voss. She was not ready for that information to leave the ridge in someone else's hands. Croft had read the botanical sections with the attention of a man who understood what he was reading. He had then looked at her samples. He had then been quiet for a long time. He had said, "I will buy everything you can produce at the same price Ware is paying you, and I will take it to markets he cannot reach." They had an agreement by noon. In the 2 years since, Croft had been as good as his word and better. He came twice a year in spring and in fall, and each time he left with whatever she had ready and left behind a bank draft that had grown each visit as his market connections deepened and the reputation of Flint Rock Ridge Goldthorn resin spread through the medical supply networks of the eastern cities. It was Croft who had, in the fall of 1883, told her something that changed the shape of what she already knew. He had been going through his Denver contacts, he said, making the kind of inquiries a man made when he was building a long-term supply relationship and wanted to understand the history of what he was buying. He had spoken to a doctor who had practiced in Cinder Falls years before, a young man at the time, now relocated to Denver, who had examined Phineas Calloway's body. The symptoms, Croft said carefully, were described to me as inconsistent with cardiac arrest. She had looked at him across the kitchen table. He said the doctor remembered tremors, gastrointestinal distress in the final hours, a presentation that, in his experience, was more consistent with arsenic poisoning than with a failed heart. She said, "I know." Croft looked at her. She told him about the journal, not the existence of it, which she still kept to herself. She told him that she had reason to believe her uncle had been aware of the threat to his life in the final weeks and that the threat had come from the direction of Ironwood Ranch. Croft said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "If there is a legal case coming, and I believe there will be, you should know that what you have just described to me is not evidence. It is testimony, and testimony requires a witness." She said, "I know that too." Now it was the spring of 1884, and the legal case had arrived on schedule, and she was writing letters, and one of them was to Ezra Croft, asking him to appear in Cheyenne as a witness to the commercial value of the Flint Rock operation and the quality of its production. She wrote the last letter at midnight and set down the pencil and looked at the stack of paper on the table. She had contracts. She had a physician who would testify to the medical application of the resin and the clinical results he had documented in 2 years of use. She had a merchant with 35 years of market knowledge who would testify to the commercial value of the operation and the quality of its products. She had a written agreement with a Denver hospital that was worth more in a single year than Harlan Voss had claimed the land was worth in total. What she did not have was a witness who had been there when the fraud was allegedly committed 30 years ago. She was not certain she could find one, but she intended to try. She went to sleep with the question still working in some background portion of her mind, the way hard problems worked when you had done everything conscious attention could do and needed to let the deeper processes finish. They rode to Cheyenne in late August, she and Colt and Ezra Croft, leaving Petra Dunn in charge of the ridge. Petra had arrived at Flint Rock in the spring of 1883, appearing at the western gap between the formations one morning in April, with a small pack and the careful expression of someone who expects to be turned away but has decided to try anyway. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, and she had grown up on a farm in Nebraska and knew more about bees than almost anyone Wren had encountered. She had heard about the operation through Cinder Falls and had come to ask if there was work. Wren had asked her 3 questions about hive management and listened to the answers and hired her on the spot. Petra was quiet and competent, and she had a way with the colonies that Wren recognized as genuine rather than learned the specific ease of someone around whom bees made different decisions than they made around other people. She had built a small cabin near the Eastern Formation in the summer of 1883 with Colt's help, and she lived in it through the seasons and managed the hive boxes with a precision that freed Wren to focus on the resin work and the correspondence and the developing complexity of running an operation that had outgrown its original scale. She was the right person to leave in charge. Wren told her where the journal was before she left. She told her what it contained. She told her that if anything happened while they were in Cheyenne, Petra should take the journal to Silas Fenn and tell him everything because Fenn, whatever his opinions about the Callaway enterprise, was an honest man and would know what to do with the information. Petra listened to all of this and said, "Nothing will happen. But I know where the stone is. It had to be enough." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The Voss lawyers were good. They had documents that looked convincing, the kind of convincing that came from quality paper and careful aging and the assurance of men who had prepared them, knowing they would be examined. They had witnesses who remembered Phineas Callaway as a difficult man, a man who kept to himself and was known for disagreements with neighboring landowners. They had Harlan Voss himself, gray-haired and dignified, at 54, speaking in the measured tones of a man who had spent decades being listened to and had no reason to expect the pattern to change, testifying that his family had been wronged and was seeking only the justice that the law existed to provide. Wren watched all of it from the plaintiff's table with the stillness she had learned on the ridge. The stillness that was not passivity, but attention, reading every document and every witness and every word of Harlan Voss's testimony with the same careful parsing she applied to the behavior of bees or the conditions of a hive. She presented her case through Dr. Ware and Croft and the contracts. She presented the evidence of a working, documented, commercially established operation on land that the Voss claims said had never been legitimately owned and was therefore essentially worthless. She presented 2 years of bank drafts and purchase agreements and written testimonials from physicians in 3 cities. The Voss lawyers attacked the validity of the original deed. They attacked the character of Phineas Callaway. They did not attack the commercial operation because attacking it would have required them to acknowledge its existence and its success, and acknowledging it would have undermined their central argument that the land supported nothing. They were doing well. She knew they were doing well. She could see it in the way the judge listened, the slight lean toward the documents the Voss lawyers presented, the careful neutrality of his questions to her witnesses. Good evidence and good presentation, and Voss had both, and she had not yet been able to produce the one thing that could crack the foundation of what he was building. On the morning of the 3rd week, the courthouse door opened. She did not turn immediately. She heard the sound of slow movement, the shuffle of someone who was not moving quickly by choice, but by limitation, and then the low voices of the clerk and someone else, an exchange too quiet to follow. Then the clerk said that a witness had come forward requesting to address the court. The clerk said the witness had information pertaining to the documentary evidence presented by the defense. The judge looked up. Wren turned. He was old in the way of someone who has been old for a long time, as if age had arrived early and settled in permanently, and his body had simply continued forward from that point. Amos Creel was 72 years old with white hair and the specific transparency of skin that comes in the last months of a life when the body begins economizing, pulling resources from the surface to sustain the center. He was walking with a cane and he was walking slowly, but he was walking with intention, the measured progress of someone who had come a long distance and was not going to stop before the destination. He had ridden a mule from his farm near the Colorado border, 3 days of travel to appear in this courtroom. The judge asked him to identify himself. He said his name, and he said his age, and he said he had been a clerk for the elder Voss, Edmund Voss, in the early 1850s when Edmund Voss had been establishing the land holdings that eventually became Ironwood Ranch. He said he had held that position for 6 years. He said he had left that position in 1857 and had not spoken publicly of what he had witnessed during those years for reasons he was not proud of, and he was here now because he was dying and had perhaps 6 months remaining and intended to use them better than he had used some of the previous years. The courtroom was very quiet. He said the documents presented by the defense were not genuine. He said he had seen the originals. He had been in the room when Edmund Voss created them, drafting the alterations with his own hand, changing the dates and the names with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that the documents would have to survive scrutiny. He had watched it happen and had said nothing and had left his employment shortly after, and had told himself for 30 years that silence was not the same as participation. He said he had been wrong about that. The Voss lawyers objected at length and with force, attacking the witness's memory and his motivations, and the reliability of a man who had waited 30 years to come forward. The judge listened to the objections and overruled them and asked Creel to continue. He continued. He described the documents in specific detail, the specific alterations, the specific dates changed, the specific names substituted. He described the method Edmund Voss had used, the particular combination of chemicals that allowed ink to be lightened without removing the paper's surface the way the replacement text had been applied in a slightly different ink that Creel had noticed at the time and had filed and had never said. He finished and sat down in the witness chair and looked at nothing in particular. The judge looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. He asked the defense to respond to specific questions about specific details the witness had described. The defense responded with diminishing authority, the arguments becoming thinner as the questions became more precise. 3 days later, the judge dismissed the case. Harlan Voss was not just defeated, he was publicly, documentably humiliated. The news would travel the way all news traveled in that part of the territory ahead of the people carrying it arriving in Cinder Falls before she did. She stood outside the courthouse in the afternoon light and breathed the Cheyenne air, which was different from Ridge air, flatter and less complex, and she thought about her uncle in the last entry of his journal. "They have poisoned my dog. I know what this means for me." She thought about the 15 years he had spent on the ridge alone, understanding what he had and not being able to protect it. She thought about the 6 words he had written on the yellowed paper, the words that had brought her to Wyoming. She had protected it. Colt came to stand beside her. Croft was behind them, talking to Dr. Ware in low tones about something logistical, the next shipment, the fall pricing, the ordinary continuation of things. "We should ride immediately," Wren said. Colt looked at her. She said, "A man who has just been humiliated in a court of law in front of a room full of people who have spent 20 years listening to him is not a man who accepts the result and goes home to reconsider his choices." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How fast can we get horses?" They were not fast enough. The ride back took 2.5 days at the pace they set, stopping only when the horses required it, sleeping in short intervals, and moving before full light each morning. She knew what she would find before she found it, with the same forward-reading certainty she had developed on the ridge, the ability to follow a situation to its logical conclusion without requiring it to arrive first. She was right. They came through the western gap between the formations in the late afternoon of the 3rd day, and she saw it before they had fully cleared the stone. 6 hive boxes. The ones Colt had built in the spring, the new design with the improved ventilation, and the angle-cut entrance slots that had increased the colony populations through the previous summer. All 6 of them smashed. Not casually damaged, not pushed over in passing, but methodically destroyed with something heavy. The wood split and splintered the frames within, exposed, and ruined the colonies scattered and gone. The goldthorn bushes along the northern face, 117 of them, by her last count, every cluster she had mapped and managed and supplemented with cuttings over 2 years, had been cut at the base, not pulled up. Cut with something sharp and deliberate, low to the ground, leaving the roots in the stone crevices, but removing everything above them. The cabin windows were broken, the stretched hide torn out. The door hung open at an angle from a single hinge. Petra was not there. She walked the full perimeter of the ridge before she went inside, looking at everything methodically, noting the damage the way she noted anything completely, and without the distortion of what she felt about it. She noted that the root cellars had not been touched, the wooden doors still in place, the contents within undisturbed. She noted that the stone walls Colt had built, being stone, had not been damaged. She noted that the cabin structure itself, being stone, was intact. She went inside. The stove had been knocked from its base and lay on its side, the stovepipe disconnected and bent. The table was broken. The shelving Colt had built along the eastern wall was pulled down, the contents scattered, and in several cases destroyed, the dried herbs and the labeled pouches, in the careful organization of 2 years of methodical work now mixed with dust on the floor. The wooden box with the resin samples was gone. She found Petra's note in the root cellar, folded twice, and placed on top of the honey jars that were the cellar's most valuable contents, the jars Petra had evidently prioritized protecting when she heard them coming. The note said, "I heard them an hour before they arrived. Sage warned me. I hid in the cellar with what I could carry quickly. I listened to them from below. When they left, I waited until dark, and then I went to Cinder Falls. I am so sorry I did not fight. Please forgive me. I will understand if you cannot." She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. Colt was in the doorway behind her. She heard the specific sound of his breathing that meant he was at the edge of something, the controlled edge, the place between what he felt and what he allowed himself to express. She said, "We rebuild." He said nothing. She said it again. We rebuild. The same way we built it the first time. He said, his voice careful and low. How? He said, we have lost the hive colonies. The gold thorn will take years to regrow from the roots. The samples are gone. The contracts are real, but we have nothing to fulfill them with. She said, the roots are in the stone. The roots survived. In 2 seasons, the bushes will be producing again from the cuttings I have saved and from the root growth. The stone walls are standing. The cabin is standing. The hive boxes can be built again. Wild swarms will come back to good locations, they always do, because the location is what they want, and the location has not changed. She looked at her brother in the doorway. He was 19 when they came here, and he was 22 now. And the past 3 years had changed his face the way outdoor physical work changed faces, weathering and defining it. And he was looking at her the way he had looked at her on a Cincinnati evening 3 years ago across a kitchen table with a legal letter and a dead man's note between them. She said, Harlan Voss destroyed what was built. He did not destroy what it was built on. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. Colt looked at the ruined interior of the cabin. He looked at her. He looked at the ridge visible through the broken window, the formation standing in the afternoon light, exactly as they had always stood, indifferent, impatient, and still full of whatever they had always been full of. He said, then we start tomorrow. She said, we start tonight. Petra Dunn appeared at the Western Gap 2 weeks later. She came in the early morning before the heat of the day, and she stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood there without coming further, her posture communicating what her expression confirmed when Wren looked at her across the distance, which was that she had arrived expecting nothing and was prepared to accept that. Wren looked at her for a moment. She thought about what it had cost Petra to come back, the specific cost of returning to a place you had left in fear, to people you had failed in a moment that mattered. She thought about what that kind of return required of a person, the understanding that you could not undo the leaving and the decision to come back anyway. She walked to the supply area she had organized against the south wall, where the tools were kept in the order she had established in the first week after they returned, and she picked up the spare hive tool and walked back to the edge of the clearing. She held it out. Petra took it. Wren said, there are 2 boxes on the eastern face that were built last week. They need their entrance slots cleared before the temperature drops tonight. Petra said, I know which ones. She went to work. Colt watched this without comment. He had been watching Petra since her return with the same careful, systematic attention he gave to structures he was assessing, looking for the fault lines, the places where the integrity was questionable. He was a methodical observer, and he did not arrive at conclusions quickly, which was one of the things that made his conclusions reliable. By the end of the first week after her return, he had stopped watching with assessment in his manner and started watching with something else, something that Wren noticed and stored and did not mention because it was not her business to mention it, and because some things developed in their own time at their own pace and did not benefit from observation. She had enough to observe. The resin was coming back, not from new growth, from the roots. In the 3rd week after their return from Cheyenne, she found the first new growth pushing from the base of a cut stem on the southern face, a thin green shoot no larger than her little finger, pale and new and entirely serious in its intention. She knelt beside it and looked at it for a long time. She did not touch it. She took out the notebook and made a note of its location and the date and the estimated height of the shoot. Over the following weeks, the root growth spread, not evenly, not in every location, but in the most protected positions. The deep crevices and the sheltered angles where the root systems had gone deepest and the stone held the most residual warmth, the goldthorn was coming back. Slowly, with the patient certainty of something that had survived this ridge for decades before any of them arrived and intended to continue surviving it. She tended it with the same care she had given the original plants and more. She protected each new shoot with small stone barriers against the wind. She sourced water from the spring runoff and directed it carefully to the root zones using channels she shaped in the rock surface with a hand tool. She cataloged each recovering plant the way she cataloged everything, completely and without remainder. By the following summer, the production numbers were a fraction of what they had been before the destruction. But they were real numbers from real plants in a real operation that had contracts and a reputation and clients who had written to ask when they could expect the next shipment. She wrote back to every one of them. She explained what had happened. She made no promises about timeline that she could not keep. She offered to release them from their commitments if they needed to source their material elsewhere while the operation recovered. Not one of them released their commitment. Harlan Voss died in the winter of 1886. Heart failure. He was found by his foreman on a December morning, sitting in the chair by the fire in his study at Ironwood Ranch, cold and still, with the expression of a man who had fallen asleep. He had been alone. His wealth and his reputation and the 20 years of careful authority he had built in this territory had not been present in that room with him at the end, because those things did not enter rooms, they only surrounded the outside of buildings. Silas Fenn told her. He came to the ridge himself, riding out on a Thursday morning, and tied his horse at the base of the western formation and walked up to find her and tell her directly with the manner of a man who understood that this was information requiring a personal delivery. She received it and thanked him, and he rode back to Cinder Falls. She stood with the information for a moment. She had imagined in the hours after Cheyenne when she first understood the full scale of what Voss had done a different kind of ending. Not revenge, she had never wanted revenge, which was an expenditure of energy for a return that existed only in the imagination. But something more complete than this. Some moment of direct accounting of the man who had poisoned her uncle and sent men to destroy her life's work, being required to stand in front of the evidence of what he had done and be seen clearly. He had not been required to stand anywhere. He had sat in a chair by a fire and gone from living to not living without anyone present and without any account being settled, because that was how it often worked, because life was not constructed around the satisfaction of accounts. She had to live with that. She understood standing in the cold December air on the ridge that still bore the marks of what Voss had sent men to do, that this was what adulthood required more consistently than anything else. The ability to absorb outcomes that did not match what justice should have looked like and continue working with what you had. Phineas Calloway had been poisoned alone on this ridge, and no one had stood for him while he was living, and no one had held the man responsible while he was alive. And that was the truth of it, and the truth of it was bitter in the specific way of things that cannot be changed. She breathed it in, she breathed it out. She went back to work. The summer of 1885 brought Juniper Hale. She appeared at the Western Gap on an August afternoon, thin as wire, 16 years old, with calloused hands and the watchful eyes of someone who had been paying attention to difficulty for long enough to have made their peace with it. She had walked from a failing farm outside Cinder Falls. She had heard about the woman on the ridge who talked to bees. Sage met her at the Gap, walking out to assess the new arrival with the amber-eyed attention she applied to everything that came through. Juniper stood still while Sage circled her once and came to sit directly in front of her and looked up. The girl looked back. She did not move to touch the wolf dog. She waited. Sage walked back toward the ridge. Wren, watching from the southern wall, understood what she had just seen. She walked down to meet the girl. Juniper said she had heard that the woman on the ridge talked to bees, and she wanted to learn. Wren looked at her. She was 16 years old, and she had walked several miles in August heat, and she had passed Sage's examination without knowing she was being examined, which was itself a form of information. Wren said, "I do not talk to bees. I listen to them. There is a difference between the two." Juniper said, "I want to learn that difference." Wren recognized something in her that she recognized rarely and always correctly. The specific quality of attention in someone who would absorb what they were taught completely, who would take the knowledge and do something with it that the teacher could not predict and had not intended, which was the only form of teaching that actually mattered. She showed her the hive boxes. She showed her the goldthorn and its stages of recovery and explained the root system and the production cycle. She talked about the resin and the honey and the bees and the way the three of them existed in a relationship that was older than anyone present. Juniper listened the way Wren listened, the way Matilda had listened, with everything and without remainder. She stayed. She built herself a shelter near the eastern formation from salvaged wood, and her own labor refusing the offer of the main cabin on the grounds that she preferred to be near the eastern hive boxes at night. She was up before dawn every morning and was the last to stop working in the evenings. She asked precise questions and remembered the answers with a completeness that was its own kind of conversation, the understanding that the information mattered enough to be held carefully. By the spring of 1886, she was managing half the hive boxes independently, and her management was indistinguishable from Wren's in its results. By the summer of 1886, she was teaching Wren things. Small observations, refinements, a slightly different reading of the hive sound in the morning that turned out to be more accurate than Wren's established method. She offered these observations with the careful deference of someone who was aware of the hierarchy but could not help what she noticed. Wren received them the way her mother had received them from her, with the understanding that knowledge was not diminished by being shared and was not owned by being known, and did not require defense against addition. She thought about Matilda more in that summer than she had since the winter of 1881. She thought about the locked cabinet and the $6 resin and the things her mother had said she could do if she ever had a proper supply of it. She thought about the evenings in the Cincinnati apartment, the two of them working at the table after supper, her mother's voice in the particular register it took on when she was explaining something she loved. She had been trying, she understood now, to pass something forward, not just to preserve what she knew, but to send it somewhere, to put it in a person who would carry it into a future Matilda could not see. Wren had been that person, and now in some form she had not planned and could not have predicted Juniper Hale was becoming that person too. The knowledge moving forward, the way it was supposed to move. Cassian Voss came to Flint Rock Ridge in the summer of 1887. He came alone. He came without announcement, appearing at the Western Gap on a July morning on a plain horse with his hands open and visible and his pace deliberate, the specific body language of someone who is arriving in a situation where body language matters and is making choices about what their body says. Sage met him at the Gap. She did not growl. She sat. She looked at him with the sustained amber attention of an animal that is not threatening but is also not uninvolved, and she stayed between him and the cabin until Wren came down from the southern face where she had been checking the Goldthorn recovery. He was 27 years old. He had his father's height and his mother's coloring lighter than Harlan, with eyes that were gray but not the flat granite gray of Harlan Voss's eyes. These eyes had something behind them, something that might have been uncertainty or might have been the specific alertness of a person who has recently had to reconsider significant assumptions. He did not dismount immediately. He said his name, and he said he had been in California when the lawsuit happened, managing business interests his father had established there, and he had come back for the funeral and had stayed to go through the estate. He said he had found his father's journal. He reached into the saddlebag at his right and withdrew a leather-bound book and held it out at the full extension of his arm, which was not a threatening gesture and was not meant to be. It was the gesture of someone offering something at a distance, leaving the decision about closing that distance entirely to the person receiving the offer. She looked at the journal. She looked at his face. She walked forward and took it. She opened it where it fell open, which was somewhere in the middle, and read what was on the page in front of her. Harlan Voss's handwriting, sharp and decisive, and organized, the handwriting of a man who never had reason to doubt the value of his own thoughts. The entry she was reading was from 1869, describing the decision to send men to surveil Phineas Calloway's Ridge operation and determine whether the old fool had actually found something or was simply too stubborn to accept a fair price. She turned to the back. She found what she was looking for in the entries from the year her uncle died. She read it. She closed the journal. She looked at Cassian Voss and said, "Why are you bringing this to me?" He said, "Because I am not my father." She waited. He said, "I have spent my whole life watching what my father did and telling myself it was just the way the world worked, that strong men took what they could and weak men protected what they had, and the difference between them was what you were willing to do." He looked at the ridge, at the stone formations, at the hive boxes on the southern face, at the evidence of what had been built and destroyed and built again on this ground. I read his journal for 3 months before I came here, all of it from the beginning. And I understand now that the way the world works is a story that some people tell to justify what they want to do, not a description of how it has to be. He lowered the journal. He said, "I am not here to ask for anything. I am not here to ask for forgiveness, which I do not deserve and did not come to receive. I am here because this journal is evidence of what was done to your uncle and to you and to this place, and it belongs in your hands rather than mine." She held the journal in both hands and looked at it and looked at him. She said, "If this is genuine, then you have given up the only thing that kept your father's reputation from being completely destroyed." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you came anyway." He said, "I am trying to work out what kind of man I want to be. I thought this was the right place to start." She was quiet for a long moment. Sage had moved from her position between them, and was now sitting beside Wren, which was not quite the same as a declaration, but was the kind of information you took into account. She said, then learn. Come and learn what this is and how it works. Work like everyone else and follow the rules of this operation and understand what was built here and what it cost. But understand also that if you ever do anything that harms this place or these people in any way, I will use that journal in every court and every paper and every conversation available to me. She held it back out to him. He took it. She said, keep it. It reminds you every day of what you are choosing not to be. She turned and walked back toward the southern face. She said over her shoulder, there are stones that need to be moved to the eastern wall. Colt will show you where. She did not look back to see if he followed. She had said what needed to be said, and she trusted the rest to resolve itself the way most things resolve themselves, which was through the sustained application of time and work. Colt's voice somewhere behind her said this way, the sound of a horse being walked, the sound of footsteps on stone. She went back to the gold thorn. 1901 arrived the way years arrived when you had been living in a place long enough for the count of them to become something other than a number. She was 37 years old. Her hands carried the stain of goldthorn resin, in the creases of her knuckles amber and permanent, the mark of a particular kind of work, done over a particular number of years. When the temperature dropped in October, the joints of her fingers reminded her of every cold morning she had spent on this ridge since the first winter, which was its own kind of record, its own geological strata. Sage had been gone for 5 years. She had died in the winter of 1896, old by any measure in her sleep, which was the best possible accounting for the end of a long life. She had been found in the morning by Wren lying on the flat observation stone south of the cabin, her chin resting on her paws, her amber eyes closed, her body entirely at rest in a way that was the difference between sleep and its permanent version, and was still after 5 years sometimes difficult to accept. Bramble was there now, Sage's granddaughter, smaller and darker, with the same amber eyes that Wren could not look at without also seeing the original, which was perhaps the point of amber eyes in wolf dogs, that they carried the particular gold of the resin in the very color of what they showed you, so that looking at them was always also looking at the thing that had brought you here. Bramble lay at her feet on the south wall in the September evening light. Below, the ridge spread across the valley and the neighboring ridges in a pattern that had grown incrementally and then exponentially were the signs of what had been built. 58 families across 5 counties were growing goldthorn using cuttings and seeds and the cultivation methods she had documented in a series of written guides that had been copied and passed forward through networks she had not designed and could not fully trace. The honey was shipped from Cinder Falls to Denver and Cheyenne and beyond. The resin was in pharmacies as far east as New York and as far south as New Orleans. The land that Silas Fenn had called a punishment from God was assessed at $14,000. Silas Fenn had died 7 years ago peacefully behind his own counter on a Tuesday morning, which was the right way for a man like him to go. His son ran the store now, and the first thing a visitor saw when they walked through the door was a shelf of dark honey jars with a hand-painted sign that read, Flint Rock Ridge Goldthorn Honey Finest in the Territory. The son had grown up with the Callaway name, meaning quality and reputation, and the specific assurance of a product that was what it said it was. He had no memory of the laughter. He had never known a time when the 2 young people from Cincinnati were considered fools. She had let that go a long time ago. You could not carry both the weight of what had been done and the work of what you were doing. One of them had to be set down, and she had set down the former and carried the latter, which was the correct choice. Juniper Hale was 32 now. She ran the cooperative that managed the distribution and the grower relationships across 5 counties, doing it differently than Wren would have done it, with innovations Wren had not thought of, and a network of connections Wren had not built because she was a different person operating in a different time, and the point had never been for her to do it the same way. The point had been for her to do it. Colt was 39. He and Petra had married in the spring of 1895 in the small church in Cinder Falls, a ceremony that Wren had stood for and that she had watched her brother move through with the specific ease of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going and finds on arrival that it is exactly right. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who ran wild on the ridge and could identify goldthorn by smell before they could read, and who treated the hive boxes with a casual reverence that suggested they had absorbed the essential understanding of what they were without being specifically taught it. Cassian Voss was 47. His hair had gone white completely, which made him look older than he was, but his hands were calloused, and his bearing was the bearing of someone who had learned to do physical work and had not set it down. He had sold the Ironwood Ranch the year after he came to Flint Rock, and had bought a smaller piece of land adjacent to their eastern boundary, and had spent 20 years planting goldthorn along every viable crevice of his own ridges. His resin never matched the quality of what came from the original formation because the particular chemistry of the ground there, the angle of sun and shelter, the mineral content of the sandstone that Phineas Callaway had understood and Wren had documented, could not be replicated precisely. But it was good. His honey was excellent. He had become part of what this place was. He had never married. There were things about a person that were not your business to know, and this was one of them, Doctor. Ware was practicing still in Denver and had written to her the previous month that a young woman from Philadelphia had applied to study with him, specifically citing his work with goldthorn resin as the reason, having encountered it in her nursing training, having read the documentation that had accumulated around its use in wound treatment over the past decade. He had hired her, he thought Wren should know. She had written back and said she was glad. Ezra Croft had retired 2 years ago, handing his trading connections to a nephew who had been trained in the business and who continued the relationship with Flint Rock as if it required no explanation, because by 1899 it required none. The evening was coming down over the ridge in the particular September way, the light going golden and then amber, and then something deeper, the stone formations holding it in their surfaces, the way stone held everything slowly and thoroughly and longer than you expected. She heard Colt before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of his step on the stone path that ran from the cabin to the south wall, slightly favoring the right leg that had been bothering him since the spring. The leg he did not mention and she did not ask about because some things were better addressed through the shaw rather than the center. He came and sat beside her on the wall. Bramble shifted to accommodate him, repositioning at Wren's feet. They sat together for a while and did not speak, which was a thing they had learned to do over 20 years on this ridge. The understanding that not all of the things between people needed to be put into words, that some of them were better carried in the quality of the silence. He said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had sold?" She considered the question with the same attention she gave to things that deserved it. She did not dismiss it and she did not rush it. She said sometimes, "I think we would have survived. Found work somewhere, built something small and careful and adequate." She paused. "But we would not have lived. Not in the way that matters. We would have existed waiting for something to happen to us. Here we made something happen." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ridge, at the formation standing in the last of the light, at the goldthorn in its dark clusters along the base of the stone, at the hive boxes tucked into the crevices where the warmth lasted longest. He said Mother would have been proud. She smiled. It was small and private, not for anyone else. She said Mother would have said we were being dramatic. Then she would have asked to see the honey. He laughed. It was a full, warm sound, the laugh of a man who had found his place and knew it and did not take the knowing for granted. She had not heard him laugh that way when they were in Cincinnati. She was not certain he had been capable of it then. He said, "Rosie wants you to come for supper tonight. The children have been asking for the story." She said, "Which story?" He said, "The one about how we came here. The fire and the winter and the man who tried to take everything and couldn't." She said, "That is a long story." He said, "They have time." He looked at her. "We all do now." He stood and offered his hand. She took it and let him help her up the same way she had always let him help her with the things that required two people, which was not weakness, but the practical understanding that some things were simply easier with another person's hand. Bramble rose with them, stretching in the long-limbed way of wolf dogs, and fell into step beside Wren. They walked toward the stone house that Colt had built 12 years ago at the base of the South Formation, where the windows showed the warm amber of lamplight, and through the open door came the sound of children's voices and the smell of supper on the stove. She paused at the door. She looked back at the ridge. The formations were dark against the darkening sky, the goldthorn invisible now in the falling light, only the shapes of the stone visible, unchanged and unchanging. The wind came through the gaps in the formation in the evening way, lower and more complex than the daytime wind, carrying the faint, warm medicinal scent of the resin on the air. She had learned the smell of this place so completely that she no longer noticed it most of the time, the way you no longer noticed your own breathing. She noticed it now. She thought about Phineas Calloway on this ridge for 15 years alone, understanding what he had and not being able to protect it. She thought about the 6 words he had written on yellowed paper. She thought about the moment she had held that paper at the kitchen table in Cincinnati and read it and understood in the specific way of her mother's daughter that it was not the note of a man losing his mind, but the note of a man who had seen something real and was afraid of what would happen to it after he was gone. What had happened to it was this. What had happened to it was 58 families and Dr. Ware's salve in New York pharmacies and Juniper Hale's cooperative and the stone house with the lamplight and the children asking for the story. This was what happened when you did not sell. This was what happened when you looked at what was actually there instead of what you expected to find, when you trusted the knowledge you had been given enough to use it in the places where there was no other authority available, when you stayed on the ground and did the work and built the thing one stone at a time and then rebuilt it and then built it again. The wind moved across the ridge and carried the scent of goldthorn into the evening air, the same way it had carried it before she arrived and would carry it after she was gone, the ridge indifferent to individual lives, but patient with the work of them holding what was placed in its stone, the way deep stone always held things, completely, and longer than you expected. She turned and went inside.